It is officially part 4 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sewalong. Today, I'll show you step by step how to prepare and sew the facings to this dress. First, align the upper front facing with the lower front facing along the short edge with right sides together. And when you match the notch, you'll notice that the curved edge of the facings should align. Pin and sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and repeat these steps for the opposite side's facings. Then align the short edges of the back facing with the short edges of the upper front facing with right sides together and pin. When you pin these seams, you'll notice that the upper front facings cross each other, and that's correct. You're starting to see the wrap shape take place. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and repeat this for the opposite side. Press the seams you just sewed open. Then sew along the outside edge of the facings, the edge without the notches, with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This will be our guide for pressing. You might notice that I've started sewing at the center of the back facing. This is just a habit that I've gotten into when sewing things around a neckline, and it just ensures that if the fabric does stretch at all while sewing, it stretches uniformly on each side. Press the edge of the facing towards the wrong side on the stitch line. At the seam of the upper and lower front facing, snip into the seam allowance just up to the stitch line. Okay, our facings are ready to be pinned and sewn onto the dress. Be sure that your shoulder seams are pressed towards the back. And then lay the facings onto the dress with right sides together. Match the shoulder seams and pin there. Then match up the notches on the upper front facing and the notches on the lower front facing and pin. You can place as many pins as you need between those points. The bottom of the facing should align with the lowest notch on the front bodice. It will not extend all the way to the hem. And finally, sew the facings to the dress with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I like to clip into the seam allowance just up to the seam, not through it, around the back neckline. And I also like to clip notches out of the curved portions where the upper and lower front facings meet. Just 2 more steps to complete our facings. The next step is to understitch. You can press the facings and the seam allowances away from the bodice now if you prefer, but I typically just finger press them as I sew the understitch. When you understitch, you're sewing the facing and the seam allowance together so that when the facing is folded towards the wrong side of the dress, you'll get a nice crisp fold, and you won't see the seam from the right side of the dress. You'll notice that as I sew, I'm using my fingers to press open the seam as much as I can, and I'm also making sure the seam allowance stays pressed towards the facing. You can go really slow around the curve of the upper front and lower front facing seam. And you'll see that I'm just essentially edge stitching here with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. It's the final step now for our facings. We just need to sew them down. After we understitch, we will fold the facings towards the wrong side of the bodice and edge stitch them in place. Again, you might want to press your facings towards the wrong side before you sew, but I find that after we've understitched, it creates a nice crisp fold, so you might not need to. You can play around with that. And you're just sewing the facing to the dress with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I like to sew the seam from the inside of the dress to ensure that I catch it with the stitch the entire way around. And you'll just pivot around the curve where the upper front and lower front facing meet. Okay, that's it for part 4 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sew-Along. In part 5, I'll show you how to sew the side seams, the hem, and how to sew on the buttons.